Good morning, and thank you for inviting me here to this lovely city. I have the pleasure of being exactly where I'm supposed to be, doing exactly what I'm supposed to be doing. And that's a very good feeling for a mother to have. My daughter visited Africa, and she asked me before she died to please take my husband and go. It was one of her wishes that I open up my world and travel more. And my husband and I have been doing that, and we're very, very pleased to be here. I can't thank you enough, Lee Last. None of this would have happened without you and all the work you do. I agree that you're equal to multiples of the rest of us. We, in this room, live in challenging times, and the challenges of upholding human rights in today's political setting are numerous. We affirm the right to live and die with dignity, in peace, and without suffering. But how can we, the people in this room, make a difference with this cause? As a board member of the respected organization Death with Dignity National, which is located in Oregon, which is a bit of an incubator in this concept, I am here to tell you that one of the ways that each of you can make a difference is through story. As the author of a book about the journey with my daughter, my terminally ill daughter, towards death, I am here to tell you that the way to make a difference is with personal story. And you may be saying, I'm not a good speaker, I don't have an interesting story, I don't know how I can make a difference. I'd like to reflect on an African proverb right now. I think it's very appropriate to our movement. If you think you are too small to make a difference, you haven't spent a night with a mosquito. I'd like you to think about that for a moment. Bzzz. My little mosquitoes. My daughter was a mosquito. She had mosquito-like intensity, and she could convince her parents and her family and her doctors that she must be listened to, just as a mosquito does. Humans are hardwired for story. The human mind is a story processor, not a logic processor. An American psychologist, Professor Jonathan Haidt, said this. He said that human beings can use logic inside of stories better than logic that's outside of a story. 70% of what we learn is through stories. Stories are how we make sense of our world. Stories not only help people to understand the meaning of what we are saying, it allows people to remember what we said, and they reiterate it to others with more accuracy and carrying our import. So how do we, who are working on the issue of allowing physician-assisted dying, using story? We tell stories that illuminate the issues that are shaping our world today. And we tell these stories in such a compelling way that we make people sit up and say, this is not right. I want to help. And that is how we must use story. Facts and figures are memorable to computers, not to people. Research on memory irrefutably shows that all the critical details, the statistics, the graphs, the bar charts, the pie charts, are more effectively absorbed if they are inside a story. And the audience is able to digest and root out that information if it is within a story. Even more important, they become more significantly actionable by the people that are listening to them. Charts and graphs and tables appeal to one side of our brain, the left analytical side, and logic has told us over the years decisions are made with that side of the brain, right? So we've appealed to that side of our brain for many years in sales and other occupations. But a few years ago, a neuroscientist in California, at the University of California, began studying patients that had brain damage in the part of the brain where emotions are generated. And he found that these patients seemed quite normal, except that they had no emotions. And they had one other thing in common that was quite odd. They had a difficult time making decisions, even decisions as simple as what to eat for breakfast. So this was the first time he realized that the part of the brain that controls emotions also is very involved in decision making. This study came as a shock to many sales organizations because they had been completely focusing on the left side of the brain, and they realized that if they wanted their customers to make decisions, they needed to present the material differently. Decision making is emotional. The latest findings in neuroscience confirm this. Okay, so we have these two sides working. The right and the left sides have different ways of processing the information. The left side is analytical, the right side is experiential. And scientific studies have noted that even audiences like an audience full of engineers respond better to communication with both sides of the brain. So we're going to use story to illuminate subject. And after working for 4 years, almost 4, in educating and advocating on the subject of physician-assisted death, I've noticed that there are 3 types of stories that I rely on. Each story shines a light on something. The first type of story I use are heartbreaking stories that shine a light on the problem. These stories are all too easy to find. There's no shortage of this type of story. The second type of story that I use is a story that is an inspirational story. And these stories are of pioneers or mavericks. These are of people who have made difficult journeys toward death, and they have refused to stop and take no for an answer. And finally, the third kind of story that I use in my work is the story of success, where lawmakers and community members and doctors and patients have supported the terminally ill and their pursuit of a gentler death. And these are wonderful stories to tell. The first type of story shines a powerful light on a problem. These stories are stories of human beings who have died terrible deaths. They didn't want to die the way they were dying. And there is no problem in finding these stories. Most of us know this. We are drowning in these stories. Stories like the elderly man who simply wanted to die at home, but died in a hospital on a ventilator, being tube-fed, his hands restrained. Or the patient who died during an inappropriate cardiopulmonary resuscitation, where his staff nurse said, quote, "It was a dreadful situation. We should never have started CPR. It was so undignified." There was blood everywhere because the patient had just been anticoagulated, and it looked like a slaughterhouse. What an awful way to go. And there are stories of overtreatment of patients, which tend to happen in young patient settings, where it's so intense that this young person is dying that the spouses and families and relatives surround this young person and say, "Fight all the way, do everything." And they demand that the doctors do all that they can, which puts the doctor in a very awkward position. These patients are cut open, perforated with tubes, hooked up to machines, and assaulted with drugs, all in a futile effort to save their life. And of course, there are the stories of stage 4 cancer patients who are in unrelenting pain. And the statistics show that 50% of patients with cancer pain are inadequately treated for that pain. And some of the pain, nurses and doctors, if they are truthful, will tell you is not manageable. It's not because they aren't trying to manage it. It's breakthrough pain that they can't manage. A few days after Christmas last year, the woman you are looking at, Eva Thompson, died of metastatic colon cancer. Eva shared her story and testified before lawmakers in Maine about wanting the legal right to pursue a peaceful death. Unfortunately, Maine, to date, has not passed the death with dignity law, and they left Eva to die the hard way. Further, Eva had difficulty with opioid medicine. So this left her with terror about her pain being adequately managed. And it created a nonstop sense of worry about dying. Eva's daughter describes her mother's death as her last days as not living. Her mother was not able to eat or move or even ask for morphine or describe her own pain. Eva could not articulate that she was in pain, and so they had to watch her moaning and her facial expressions, and they had to read her face in order to know how much pain she was in. Eva was in the exact situation she had tried to avoid by testifying. Her daughter, Kayla, said, quote, "If I could have spared her those last few days of lying helpless and in pain, I would have done so." There are many heartbreaking stories, and they are what I come to think of as hard deaths. I think that so many people in today's world are removed from death, have never experienced death firsthand, and so it's an abstract concept to them. These stories of bad deaths help personalize this and help these people understand that they are just one bad death away from understanding death with dignity. The second kind of story is an inspirational story because it illuminates a person who tenaciously stood up for their right, and they consciously said how much pain they would endure, and they said, "I want control over my own death." These are the stories of terminally ill patients who faced opposition and yet doggedly pursued what they thought was their innate human right. These are the stories of pioneers. These are the stories of game changers. I've come to think of my daughter as one of these people, a game changer. Game changers are people who will not take no for an answer. As the mother of Brittany Maynard, I'm proud to share the story of my 29-year-old daughter and how she faced impending death from a massive brain tumor. Brittany's story went viral on the internet. Her beautiful face graced the cover of People magazine in the United States, and many people have asked me what I think it was about Brittany's story that struck a chord with people the world over. And I think it was a combination of things. One, my daughter focused with mosquito-like intensity. She turned her greatest challenge into an opportunity for self-actualization. She wanted to use her death to feel fulfilled and to have had a purpose in life. And in those last days and weeks of her life, she literally burned like a flame with the energy of being a change maker. And it was a beautiful thing to see. She held on to her desire for quality of life instead of quantity of life, especially since the doctors were defining quantity of life in days not months, not years. And so she decided that she wanted to relocate from where we lived in California, where there was no law, and move to Oregon, where there was a law. And she bravely spoke out for the rights of other terminally ill because she said, it's not fair. Our family can afford to make this move. Most families can't. She spoke up even when she had terrible headaches. She spoke up when her face was swollen from using the drugs that they used to keep the pressure down inside her cranium, heavy steroid drugs, which cause you to have what's called a moon face. And this was hard for a young girl to have her looks change so much. She said, "Mom, when I look in the mirror, I just see cancer." She undoubtedly impacted the trajectory of things in the United States and possibly in the world with her bravery. And Brittany's support for the law and her death utilizing the law helped California pass the law, because my husband and I testified and talked to our legislators and said, why did we have to move? Why did we have to move our daughter? Why did we have to layer that extra complication on an already complicated situation? Since her death, California has passed the law, Colorado has passed the law, Hawaii has passed the law, Washington, D.C. has passed the law and fought for it, fought a great battle for that right, that autonomy over their district. 24 states now have legislation before their legislators. This is movement. It might not be as fast as we would like it to be, but it is movement. My daughter taught us that the greatest way to create change is through open conversation. And beginning a conversation about death is a vulnerable conversation. And there is great bravery in being vulnerable. Vulnerability allows us to connect to other people. It allows other people to open their minds. My daughter said, "Who has the right to tell me how much pain I deserve?" Brittany was self-determined, and she was an example of patient empowerment. She did not buy the paternal mode of medicine, where your doctor is your father who tells you basically what to do. She demonstrated that it was her right to ask questions, and she demonstrated that she could disagree with treatment plans and insist on having some say in how she died. She demonstrated that desiring a good death is not really a political issue. She told me, "I think politicians of all kinds are afraid of death, Mom." And she said, "This is not a religious issue either. No church will tell me how long I must suffer." This subject is bigger than religion. It is bigger than politics, my daughter said. "Mama, we're talking about what should be an indisputable human right." And finally, Brittany taught us that living a good life is very closely tied with wanting a good death. She was dying. She didn't want to die. And she urged us to live, really live, our wild and precious lives. And she demonstrated that she could use the last months of her life to enjoy life fully. So we traveled, and we zip-lined in Canada, and we dog-sledded in Alaska, and we kayaked in San Francisco Bay. We climbed Hurricane Hill in Washington State, and we walked through trails of beautiful trees in Oregon. And then finally, we helicoptered over the Grand Canyon. That was her last check off her bucket list. Brittany literally lived all of her last moments to the very greatest capacity that she could. I think there's a great beauty in that. And I think you'll see that in many stories of people who utilize this law. Their death is very much in compatibility with the way they live their lives. The next type of story I'm going to tell you about is a story that shines brightly as a beacon of hope. These stories show us that we can do a better job. An example of this third type of story is 41-year-old Betsy Davis, who lived near me in San Diego. Betsy had wavy red hair, freckled-faced, and just an absolutely luminous eyes and expression. She was an artist. And she had been losing control of her body for 3 years to the disease called Lou Gehrig's or ALS. She was in a wheelchair. She had lost all control of her legs. She was struggling to use her hands. Speech was becoming more difficult, and swallowing would be next. And so she chose to use the brand new California law, which was a bold thing to do. And she decided she would not let her disease control how she died. Her case is unusual in that she decided she would invite 30 friends and family to join her on a July weekend for a gigantic party. They had pizza and a fashion show and music, and the fashion show was Betsy's clothes, which were fabulous because she was an artist, and so her girlfriends wore all her clothes and got to keep that outfit. So there was this beautiful spirit of giving and sharing. Then after the party was over, Betsy was wheeled to a canopy bed that was on the hillside, and she watched her last sunset. And then she took her medication, and she passed away. Betsy's sister, Kelly Davis, described the way her sister died. Quote, "My sister is an example of exactly how this law is intended to be used, allowing a dying young woman the ability to assert control over chaos and uncertainty of terminal illness. She turned death into a reason to celebrate, and she was there to enjoy the party." Betsy Davis's story is the antithesis of a bad death. I like to think of Betsy's and Brittany's death as what I call as good as it gets death. Because as the mother of a child that died too soon, good death is hard for me to swallow. I don't think Brittany dying at 29 could be described as a good death, but she and I described it as a good as it gets death under the circumstances. In stories like Betsy's, the patient is not left to die in a way they don't want. In these stories, the patient calls the shots. And by the way, these stories can include patients who apply for a prescription and never fill it, because these are happy stories as well. Just knowing that they have the prescription brings them enough peace in their chaos that they're able to pass away without the terror and anxiety that they had before, and they've never even filled it. Other patients fill the prescription and have it in their homes, but don't use it. So this is a wide variety of stories of success. Those who advocate for death with dignity live in challenging times. We, in this room, know this more than most. One of my favorite authors wrote this, Pema Chodron, "Nothing ever goes away until it has taught us what we need to know." The conversation about dying in peace has begun. And it may quicken, and then it may soften. It may grow quiet. But this subject isn't going away until we have learned what we need to know. This conversation will keep returning like a mosquito in the air. It will be spoken of by new advocates, new supporters, new leaders, new personal stories at a grassroots level until the legislation reflects the will of the people. I believe this with all my heart. Thank you.